Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what was initially quite an impromptu stream. We've given it some thought, starting quite late. Let me know what you think about the time. I'm joined this evening by Rei Murasame. Good evening.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you on. Let me just get the chat up so that I can see everything. Basically, we're here to talk as kind of a furtherance to discussion which was being had on Twitter earlier, kind of regarding the whole media kerfuffle around Carl Benjamin, but also the kind of the deeper issues of the statements he's made in the past, and really what I mean. Would you say you consider yourself to hold the establishment position on him?
Yeah, I guess so. Insofar as the establishment position is people shouldn't say these things, and therefore they should not be surprised when they don't get votes.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's fair enough. So like when you say people shouldn't say such things, do you mean in the context of like it's morally wrong to say that sort of thing, or do you mean that legal action should be taken?
No, I don't. Well, I can't think immediately of what legal action could be taken on it. It's just basically a matter of sort of public order and decency, where people are not expecting that you're going to come out and make those kind of jokes, and then if a candidate in the election actually does that, they can't possibly be surprised if the media is going to be like, okay, we're just going to stenographize what it is that you said, and then the voters are going to get really irate about it. I mean, they should, right? Or
Well,
at least you would expect that they would.
well, given the narrative that the media is spinning, I'd expect that they would. But the difficulty is that the media has been dishonestly portraying what he's been saying.
Well, okay. What's the honest? This is something that no one has said to me yet. So I want to hear it from, like, I don't know, from the lion's mouth, as it were. What's the honest portrayal in your perspective of what Carl Benjamin was trying to say?
Sure. Do you want the original comment or the comments currently?
Both of them, because obviously they're interconnected.
Sure. So the first one was, uh, well, as we. So the first comment, the "I wouldn't even rape you" to Jess Phillips, was, as you know, an emotional attack on Jess Phillips for attacking the who is it, Philip Davis, trying to get a debate on men's issues in Parliament. Jess Phillips laughed at the idea. He perceived that to be tacitly laughing at the issues at hand, including male suicide, which he has obviously a personal connection to. And so he crafted a tweet which, because he wanted to have a debate with Jess Phillips, he'd been trying to get a debate with her. In response, she had blocked him, and he wasn't getting any traction there. So he decided to do something and create a tweet which they could not ignore, which he knew would rustle the jimmies, as it were, which would be offensive, and would cause her to take notice of him so that he could lay out his then argument. It then made national news, obviously, etc., etc. So that was the plan with the first one. It was not sincere in the sense of the even part. And it was clearly satire, a joke, not a representation, shall we say, of Carl's actual position on, women and rape and those sorts of things. As in, he doesn't hate women, he doesn't want to rape women, he wouldn't rape women, etc., etc. It was purely contextualized in the format of satire, like a statement designed to be offensive. Yes. So that's the first one. And then the second one, obviously, is the fact that it keeps being re-brought up. And then he made, obviously, his joke in, I believe it was called the Media 2019 or something like that, or Mainstream Media 2019, which was removed by YouTube yesterday, I believe, where he was doing a skit. He was doing several jokes in a row, and in there he also mentioned that he wouldn't even rape Jess Phillips, and then added on to the end something along the lines of, "I might be pressured to do it." And then at the end he said something along the lines of, "But let's face it, there's not enough beer in the world for that." So just kind of additional to that. And that's less to do with the event of Jess Phillips laughing at male suicide, and more to do with him saying that like this is a 3-year-old tweet. It's effectively irrelevant at this point. It's well known that I was not being sincere, and so but the media will take anything and try and smear me with it at this point, even when it's clearly in the context of a joke, regardless of whether or not you agree with the joke, regardless of whether or not you find the joke funny. It is clear that his intent with the comment is to be humorous, it's to be comedic. It was uploaded to his YouTube channel. It had a very high like to dislike ratio from his very particular audience, which obviously enjoys that kind of very edgy humor. But that, you know, in a sense of like the people who were being offended and didn't enjoy that joke, etc. It's kind of like that joke's not for you, in the same way that certain comedians are not for you or for me, etc. Because like we just don't enjoy their content, etc. That makes sense.
Yes, but can they be surprised that when viewed from another angle, which is the angle of most of the observers, that when they saw the first quote joke, quote unquote, that he came out with, that would be seen as normalizing a scenario in which threats of sexual violence are the norm. So when he says, for example, he wouldn't even, with the word even included there, this then conjures up the idea that there is a normality in which these things would ordinarily happen, except for the fact that it's Jess Phillips, and therefore today it will not. Right?
I mean, do
And
you
so
think
that creates a normality. And then when you have him, then after everyone attacked him on this, and he said, "No, it's just a joke. We're just memeing, bro. You know what's wrong, etc., etc." And people were being thoroughly, I guess, let's say, gaslit on the issue, right? And people kind of taking a step back, like, okay, maybe it's a joke. We don't know what jokes are anymore and what's a non-joke. Where are we in this thing? Then he comes out and decides to do that video that you talked about, which is the second one, where he said that people have been complaining and that therefore he might be persuaded to change his mind, and then made the comment on the beer. Now, again, that just essentially undermines everything that he was trying to accomplish through claiming it's just a joke. Because how does he go from it's just a joke to then doing another, quote, joke in which he says that he might be persuaded to change his mind? Again, I think they shouldn't be surprised that the Times then came out and published the article that they published, which basically said that Carl Benjamin may be capable of changing his mind on that issue. I mean, that actually made it worse than it was at the beginning.
I mean, you say that, but I don't think it's clear. Like, I mean, you've made two statements there. Like, the first is about normalization.
People in the chat are asking me, what do they want him to do? He could have just never done any of it at all if he didn't want to, like, take the damage that he was going to take off that. I mean, it wasn't strictly necessary that he engaged in any of that conversation.
I mean, the first comment that he made opened the conversation. The second one is his response to people making up a conversation about him that's inaccurate. When it comes to him changing his mind, he hasn't changed his mind. He's making a joke about changing his mind, and I think that it's clear, irrespective of whether or not you think like the joke is either appropriate or funny, that he believes it's a joke, that he has come at it with the intention to be.
It's a joke, right? But I mean, let's be real here. I'm sure there are things that I subjectively believe are jokes that I would never say on a campaign trail if I were a politician. And the reason I wouldn't do that is because I don't want to lose.
Sure, and you can argue that his campaign is doomed to failure because of it. I mean,
there are whole realms of senses of humor that I could hypothetically have, although obviously people online believe I don't have a sense of humor for some reason, but there are whole realms of senses of humor that I could have. It's just that I never used to leverage them because I know what's going to happen if I do.
Sure, okay. So all you're arguing at this point is that he's more ignorant than you and that he is pursuing a losing tactic. I mean,
and that these things become losing tactics precisely because they are offensive. It is easy to find something to be funny if you are in the position where you are not affected by the outcome of the thing that's being made fun of.
Well, this is the question, isn't it? In terms of like it being effective or not, because he believes that he's speaking to a silent majority, which have not made themselves known.
People are complaining that this was said years ago as a joke and it was not said on a campaign trail. In fact, it was said on a campaign trail because when it was brought back to him and placed in front of him on a piece of paper, and obviously this is an exaggeration here, but you know what I mean. It was brought in and placed in front of him and said, what do you think of this that you said before? Do you denounce this particular position or are you going to like double down on it? Then he doubled down on it. Okay. Now, if someone looks at something and doubles down on it on a campaign trail, it means they effectively said it again.
And he said it
So
in.
I don't understand why, and people are going to get annoyed with me because I'm addressing the chat, but I think it's right for me to address the chat sometimes when the chat is saying things and they need to be responded to. So no, I think it is right to say that he actually did say it the second time, because if you double down on something you said years ago while you're in a political campaign, it means you've effectively said that thing again. And I
Sure.
don't think it would be I don't think it'd be considered a lunatic or batshit response for me to have that view.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure, but I don't see why. Like, it's perfectly in line with his principles to not apologize for that, because in his mind, he's like, it's an insincere comment. It was intended to offend. It did just that, and he's not the main thing he has, because he said he would apologize to Jess Phillips, right? But the main thing that he has is he's like, I will apologize to Jess Phillips if she wants to come and sit down with me and ask for an apology. I also would like an apology from her for laughing at the idea of men, because that offended me. And even if
Well, perhaps he could have done.
and so
Perhaps he
on.
could have done that. No one is saying he couldn't have asked Jess Phillips for an
Well, he
apology for any
has.
perceived slight which she may have put toward him.
Well,
But
he
instead of doing
has.
it that way, he chose to go the other way, and now look where it's ended up.
Well, he has made that offer, right? So she did an offensive thing for him. He did an offensive joke back at her.
And
He's then,
everyone remembers the latter one.
and of course they do, because his was considered to be controversial, and that's kind of part of the point that he's making, is that, like, what she did should be controversial, but people don't really, like, the mainstream political elite consider that to be completely normalized. And before we get too far on, I do just want to go back to your idea that you said. Like, joking about the issue normalizes like the prevalence of it in society. Do you think that making jokes about the Catholic Church abusing boys normalizes pedophilia?
I don't think that people should actually make deliberate jokes about that. Like, I'm not sure what kind of jokes you're referring to, but like if they're explicit jokes that kind of make it sort of like less of the awful crime that it actually is, then obviously I think that if someone were running a political campaign, for example, or were trying to be a politician and were making jokes about it, like if it were some kind of frivolous thing, then I would not be surprised if people would take offense at it.
Sure, you wouldn't be surprised if people took offense, but you also said that the people shouldn't make that comment at all.
Well, we can't control words that people say. Like, it's possible to hold the opinion that someone shouldn't say a thing, but then still have the right to say that thing. So
Hmm.
obviously, I've taken the position all along that people obviously have the right to free speech, meaning that it's possible for Carl Benjamin to say things that I actually deeply deplore. He is free to say those things, but then he's
Hmm.
also free to never get my vote.
Sure. And he's free to never get the vote of everyone who thinks the same way as you. And that's kind of
Exactly.
what.
So I don't understand why we've been having this big controversy over this, or why it's considered a lol cow position, for example, to say, "Oh, a politician has said something I don't like. He will never get my vote." I mean, this seems to be a logical, sort of a logical direction where democracy goes. Instead of having this weird thing where, oh, the press is not supposed to report on things that he says. Oh, the press is supposed to like be really, really soft-handed with him and to cuddle him all the way through whatever campaign he happens to be on, so that his feelings don't get hurt while he's trying to insult people. I don't
the,
get it.
the trouble is, from what I can see, is the double standard in the representation of people, and the disingenuousness of the media, because the media is naturally sensationalist, right? Like, it wants to drive as much traffic as it can to its sites, to its to watch its television, and it knows that its revenue is decreasing year on year, and so we've seen the kind of the rise of making things more and more clickbait and so on and so forth. But it's like, you will see things such as, like, Carl Benjamin like endorses rape or whatever it was, says he would rape Jess Phillips. I think it was I don't know if it was a Guardian or the Times, which that one appeared in. And it's not so it didn't say Carl Benjamin makes joke
Can
about
we
Carl.
invite people from the chat onto the show, by the way, just in case? I'm sorry to interrupt you there. Can we invite people from the chat onto the show?
It depends who it is, but I'd rather keep it just between
Okay,
us
I
and
want you
keep it
to
nice
give
and clean.
Jamesy Anubis a link to the show and have him come on and talk to me directly if he wants to insult me from the chat. This is what I do occasionally. If you insult me hard enough in the chat, I'll actually invite you onto someone else's stream to have a go at me. And then we'll see if you can say it in person.
I think we'll keep things down. But if you're a moderator on the chat, don't let things get too ad hom in there, please. Just time people out if they're getting a bit too irate. The Harry channel says the offensive tweet was a response to Jess talking about rape threats she was constantly receiving. She was arguing for sanitizing the internet. Her offensiveness over male suicide was met in kind. This was the kind of the second issue of the day on the first comment that Carl made, which was that the policies which she was pursuing, he believed was something which was very detrimental, and so he characterized it in that in the same way as you would characterize general free speech and censorship, which is who do you trust to censor what you can and cannot say. And so
well, I mean, obviously my position is that I trust no one to make those calls.
Exactly. And so he said that, and he has said, whether or not there's no evidence that I've seen of before the action taking place of him using this. I don't know if it's a post hoc justification. However, he has also said that he made the comment in such a way that it was not, and it was categorically not, an actual threat. And therefore, I know you've made an argument that there was an.
I've heard this before, but did he consider then the idea that by doing it in that kind of weird esoteric way, that he would simply be providing an argument to the people who would want to have internet censorship, if you want to call it that, or internet regulation of speech, which again, I should emphasize, I am not in favor of internet regulation of speech in the style that they were discussing, but by responding to her in the way that he did, and by making it not a direct threat, but making it this weird esoteric pseudo passive-aggressive threat where everyone could kind of understand the environment he was creating, but no one could definitively say that he had directly said it to her. By doing it that way, he's made it so that when people do call for censorship, you're going to be having people calling for like advanced level esoteric censorship, where they're going to be trying to divine the true meaning behind your words, as opposed to simply sort of regulating on direct threats and things like that. So he's actually made it worse, if you think about it. He's made it worse.
The counter to that is that he believes people are smart enough to divine for themselves that what he's saying is clearly insincere and is clearly satire. But like, I mean, I know that you think it's ludicrous, right? But it's like that's his side of the argument, and that's kind of what the politics of it is the kind of cultural battle between people who hold his perspective and people who hold yours, and whether or not which side the people is eventually going to rally around. And it's clearly something which is quite controversial in terms of, like, there are a number of people who support him, there's a number of people who don't, and then in the middle you've got this like huge array of people who've never heard of Carl Benjamin and getting their information.
And also, hold on, before we go any further, I just want to clarify something again as well, because I know that I'm going to be misquoted on this repeatedly, so I want to make sure that I say it multiple times, so that when I'm misquoted on it, I can say I said it X number of times in the same broadcast. So again, I never said, just in case anyone is wondering, I never said that people should be restricted from making certain jokes. I said that people have the freedom of speech to make any joke that they want, even if it's a joke that I find to be deeply offensive. It's just that I won't like people if they make those jokes, right? I would appreciate it. That does not mean that I plan to regulate them or stifle their speech in any way. Similarly, I don't support, excessive internet regulation against what people can and cannot say either. People are allowed to be offensive and say things that I don't like.
And that's
the reason I keep repeating this is because what I do every now and again is I'll check the chat to see what the chat is assessing my position to be. I notice that if I don't look back perhaps every 10 minutes to correct it, there'll be someone in the chat saying, oh, so she's trying to control our speech. Oh, she's trying to ban our speech. Like, literally, that is the opposite of my position. And I just want to emphasize that once again. And perhaps 15 minutes from now, I will emphasize that point again, because by then they will all have forgotten it.
All right. So let me see. I did. Let me pop this down. So yes, let's counter that. Let's counter that. It's not a problem. What do you think about the idea of kind of gallows humor in general?
In general, I mean, it really depends. It really depends on the specific joke. Like, I can't make like broad pronunciations on how I feel about jokes in general.
So there's this kind of the main brunt that I can see of your argument is kind of like, let's say you've got a mortician, right? Right. They have to deal with death every day. They live in a quite depressed, in the same way that there's a gallows humor that crime scene detectives gather as well if they have to see like too many murder sites and stuff like that, right? And you're like, yeah, they should have the freedom to make the jokes that they want to make in that, as long as it's also understandable if someone makes a complaint about them doing that, if they make an off-color joke to a family member or something stupid like that. But someone running for election campaign should eschew this kind of the kind of edgy humor narrative for the sake of trying to emphasize policy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I can't prescribe to someone how they should do a particular campaign, but I would say the safest bet that you can make would be to not engage in gallows humor if you're not sure as to how it'll be received, particularly if you're in a country where there's going to be a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives, and you're probably going to end up offending someone.
I mean, he thinks he knows exactly how it's going to be received, certainly by the media, and then he is making a judgment about how the general population is going to receive it. Like in his mind, like a lot of this thing is exposing the media, disingenuous nature of the media, the idea that they are smearing him in an like what's the phrase I'm looking for? Like in a way which is illegitimate. Like they are saying things about him, ignoring all the context and portraying him in the worst possible light purely because they don't like him, as opposed to trying to objectively present the facts.
Well, I mean, some of them probably didn't even know who he was until they discovered him
Mm-hmm.
just 2 weeks ago. So, like, how could they be grinding axes on him because they just didn't like him and things like this? Like, I mean, obviously, perhaps they just didn't like him from the start because they knew he was a UKIP candidate, for example.
It's not about him.
But, I mean, this is the same. I mean, this is the same media which will essentially lie down on the floor and let Nigel Farage walk around and do whatever he wants anyway.
Well, they will now.
I mean, I never really got the impression that the British media was kind of like, I don't know, some kind of hyperactive watchdog on these issues.
Well, he's gathered this kind of perspective on the media over the past 4 years. Obviously, like most of his job, if you just take This Week in Stupid, for instance, you'd spend 10+ hours on a weekend just reading like as much news as physically possible, so you could pull out what he considered to be the worst bits and pieces, or the funniest bits and pieces, so that he could kind of put in a critique or a joke in there about that. So he's built up this image in his head about what he believes the media to be right. Now, regardless of whether you think that's correct or not, he seems to be, and he certainly feels vindicated and feels correct in that the media has portrayed him, as he would say, falsely. He says that this is not what I mean, this is not what I'm about, and he doesn't trust the media to portray him in an honest light. In the same way that he feels that they give disproportionate representation to extremists on the far left wing in particular. And he feels like they will portray groups like Antifa, which we know full well is a terrorist organization, in a...
What? Do we know that for sure?
It's classed as a terrorist organization, certainly by the US
in the
government.
States, you mean the United States, but not the United Kingdom, I don't think.
Sure. Okay. Well, we'll take that. But the interactions that I've seen of Antifa in this country have been no less violent, with them, storming places, pulling fire alarms, and trying to beat people over the head. I've witnessed that, so it's kind of quite a strange proposition. Anyway, but I will admit it's not legally a terrorist organization in this country yet, but they will portray them in like a really positive or a neutral light, as you say, as opposed to a group which like say the Liberalists, or I believe it's like the Football Lads Alliance or Veterans for Peace, who are groups which typically offer their services to defend protests from conservatives and right wing and centre, from groups like Antifa, who want to call them Nazis and then march on down and shout at them and scream at them, are just disincentivize, kind of deterrent. But they get called far right, they get called Nazis and stuff like that. And it's very, as you say, like it's not accurate. That's the difficulty that I have with it. Like I see a lot of inaccuracy from the media.
Well, I mean, random people on Twitter will refer to everything as being some derivative of Nazism, but I think the press itself has been quite what's the word? I want to use the word recalcitrant. I want to use a different word.
Mm.
They've been quite. No, maybe I should just not use a large word because I cannot think of the word that I cannot think of the word that's supposed to describe this at the moment.
Mhm.
But basically, a person who is unwilling to go to excess, and so I think that the media has been not going to the excess of actually just calling everything Nazi. Like they will put a microphone in Farage's face and manage to go through the entire thing without actually calling him a Nazi, even if they don't agree with anything he's saying.
Farage appears to be the
Even
new.
with Gerard Batten, for example, they
Mhm.
didn't actually call him that.
No, they've changed the tone because they've realised that the word Nazi is now effectively like not an effective slur, but also something which could get them in trouble legally. So now
Word I
they
was
just
called
use.
reticent, by the way. But,
So,
yeah.
oh, I see. Yes, the phrase they use now is far right. When it's not clear to me that they hold any position which could be construed as far right.
Yeah, it's basically something else entirely. And so, they're quite reasonable on that, because also because of the fact that this whole thing stemmed out of like a conversation about, does Carl Benjamin hold misogynistic views, etc., etc. Simply holding misogynistic views does not make you a Nazi.
No,
I mean, it
but
can be something, but not necessarily a Nazi.
is there anything in what he said? Because the word misogyny, I think, gets used a lot out of the context of what misogyny is. Do you think he hates women?
It really depends what the definition of hate is in this case, but I mean, my understanding of it, I would say that he doesn't have much of a fondness for women in general, and by this I mean women so long as women are participating in politics in ways that are beneficial to women. Like, as soon as that happens, I think that Carl Benjamin is not enthusiastic. I mean, he built his entire YouTube career on not being enthusiastic about that.
No, he built his entire YouTube career on
Dunking
Gamergate.
on Anita Sarkeesian
Mm-hmm.
repeatedly
Mm-hmm.
until the horse had been beaten, until there was nothing left to actually dunk on.
Sure, but she
And then
wasn't doing
everyone was kind
anything
of
to
like, "How
improve
long
things
is
for
she going to do
women.
this?" And I was saying this, and I'm saying this not from the perspective of even someone who supported Anita Sarkeesian, because back when she first came out and began doing her feminist frequency videos, I actually disagreed with almost all of them.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that
Well,
obviously when Carl Benjamin came out and started dunking on her in the specific way that he did, by tying it to a broader feminist ideology and dunking on feminism as a whole, from then when she branched out into this thing of attacking everything as being a derivative of social justice warriorism, even if it's something like just basic decency, for example, that was when I disengaged and was kind of like, okay, now they're just going on beating some ideological horse now.
like
So
there's a difference between wanting to engage in civility and literally censoring your opponent.
well, I mean, I'm not aware of Anita Sarkeesian attempting to censor her opponents, but I mean, if she did, it didn't work, did it?
Well, no, it didn't, but mainly because people like Carl were outspoken.
I would have preferred that the inaccuracies that she was dealing in at the beginning during her time, if she had been met by an interlocutor who was perhaps not Carl Benjamin, things would have gone very differently.
Quite possibly, but
Because it could have been possible to have her alter some of her positions without having to have a full-on confrontation and making it into a men versus women thing. They could have actually approached it from a perspective of, well, your criticism of things that are happening in the video game industry are wrong, and the reason for that, Anita, is because you actually just got here 5 seconds ago, and so you actually don't know the history of the industry.
I mean, there were
I think
several.
that's the angle they could have gone with this from,
There
and it
was
could have been quite productive.
there were several YouTubers at the time, and I apologize, but I really cannot remember the name of the guy who did the video I'm thinking of, who did such a video at the time, and it just went virtually unnoticed. I mean, it did pretty well, but in terms of like general stats, but obviously nowhere near as much as sensationalism from Carl Benjamin did. So you get this idea that in the same way that sex sells, so does drama, especially on YouTube. And so there was really no other way. If it hadn't have been Sargon of Akkad dunking on Anita Sarkeesian, it would have been someone else.
I suppose maybe you could say that you can say that almost that the shitlords are interchangeable, but I don't know that anyone would have done it quite the way that he did.
Well, I doubt that it would have been quite the way he did. Like, he's clearly got a market appeal all of his own. Otherwise, he wouldn't have amassed quite such a following compared to, say, other people in the at that then time skeptosphere.
And also, he wasted a lot of people's time by having that conflict with Zoe Quinn as well, which again was just like, why are we doing this? Why should I care?
I don't think I watched anything to do with Zoe Quinn, so I can't comment on
The
that one.
Zoe Quinn thing was where she was being accused of sleeping with, if I understand
Oh
it correctly, she was accused of
yes,
sleeping with the journalists or
that
something
was
like
right.
this.
Yes, no,
Or
I
sorry,
remember
not
that
even the
now.
journalists with an S, but even with the journalist with just a
Yes,
singular.
it
Yeah.
it
And so I
was
didn't understand that either. Like, why was that even a big deal? The only people that would be a big deal to is people who want what was it again? Ethics in what was it? Ethics in video gaming journalism.
yes.
So what they wanted was they wanted to bring free market ethics to an industry which has never at any point in its history functioned under those ethics at any time.
Well, Zoe Quinn was the tip of the iceberg when it came to the ethics issue, where it became because it wasn't just her, right? So the idea was that she was sleeping with a games journalist. He gave her game, which was under development at the time, a favorable review
Mm.
in the magazine. People got the game because they read this review and read it's favorable. Not very many people liked it. Then it basically came out that she'd been getting this kind of preferential treatment. Then it
Mm.
became clear that there was preferential treatment being given to different developers mainly, in exchange for bribes and effectiveness across the industry. And so there was an outcry for
Right,
better
except
ethics.
the thing that I'm saying about this outcry, and people are going to obviously say the usual thing that they say about me whenever I sort of downplay these incidents, when I
Sure.
say, "Oh, well, these things are actually normal," then they usually respond by calling me an evil corporatist in the mold of Dick Cheney or something. But this is literally how the system works. Like I don't understand how people expected you were going to create a system in which everyone was going to promise not to actually personally interact with each other, and that you're going to have a firewall between people who engage in journalism and the industries in which they have access to. I
Well,
mean, how do you get access? How do you get access to politicians, for example, when you're a journalist? How do journalists get access to the defense sector? How do journalists get access to any kind of manufacturing sector? How do journalists get access to other elements of media sector, for example? Like, there's no way to do this in which people are not going to eventually make friends with each other.
yeah, make friends, but there's a
There's
difference
going to be
between
cronyism. Like, it's a fact of life.
sure, but the point is that cronyism, where it is discovered, is not a benefit to the industry, and so it should be exposed. It should be removed if possible. Until it rears its ugly head again. Which is why there are groups out there who dedicate
Okay,
themselves to fact.
who doesn't benefit from the cronyism involved? Bear in mind, because I'm just thinking, do the
The
fans actually
consumer.
even notice? Like, if you were to cover your eyes and pretend that you never saw any of that cronyism that was going on, would
Mhm.
anything in particular have changed?
Well, yes, right. So the argument is like you see this now, right? If you compare current day games journalism to say YouTube reviews of video games. So typically, I cannot remember the name of the channel, but there's a guy who does video game reviews, and he makes a very key point that because he typically receives free game keys from the developers in order to play the game, and he makes it a very good point to buy the game himself with his own money, and he gives the key out for free at the end in a giveaway, etc. And that's one of the main draws of his channel, from what I've read of his comment section, because they go, you're representing the people, you're putting your own money on the line, you actually are playing these games, you're playing them for a good amount of time. Whereas with game journos, like there's so many memes about game journos being incapable of playing certain games. I mean, there was the whole thing with a game called Cuphead, where the games journalist couldn't get past a tutorial or something to that effect, and so they're just saying, you're not representing us. You're taking bribes from big companies to give favorable reviews on games which the gaming community is not actually enjoying that much post, but you're providing misinformation effectively in exchange for money. So you've sold out your souls in exchange. And you might argue that that's how most industries work, but like in terms of games journalism, it was something that the gaming community as a whole was not happy with, and so they
Well, how
rebelled.
long have they been not happy with it? Just as
Well,
just as
since
a
it was
matter of record.
exposed.
But I mean, they're aware that it's been like that from since
Because
its inception, though,
they
right? They
didn't
would have
know
been
it.
aware of that.
Well, obviously, games journalist revenue had been decreasing over time because people were losing trust. But people didn't know why they were losing trust, and then they exposed the cronyism, and then they were like, "Oh, this is obvious that this is that," and now I have a tangible reason to boycott. There you go.
I suppose it just seems like the strangest thing to choose to get mad about, given if they're going to get off on chasing down corruption, you'd figure you'd start in a place other than video games journalism as well.
I mean, for a lot of people, it's their main hobby. I mean, especially for a lot of basement dwelling men, shall we say?
I see someone in the chat is pointing out that they didn't know they were being lied to, you moron. Well, I'm kind of thinking, well, how naive are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Like, are these people like just born yesterday afternoon or something? Do they
Sure,
think
well,
that's how it works?
not everyone's you, Ray. I mean, a lot of people, like most people that I know,
I wasn't even surprised. I mean, yeah. Now that you point that out, I wasn't even surprised by Gamergate. I was like, well, yeah, of course, right?
well, most people that I know are quite willing to take things at face value from what they consider to be an authoritative source, just because you believe that nothing's really an authoritative source.
Well, no. I'd still be willing to take their reviews, not at face value, but obviously with the fact that there's obviously someone in the background leaning on something somewhere. It's just a matter of finding out, like, what is the array of influences that are causing this thing to be written in this particular way. But of course, depending on sort of like how crucial it is to my life, then I'd be willing to accept a certain level of cronyism in particular practices. I mean, we accept levels of cronyism on almost every level surrounding the economy. And we don't have like constant mass protests and throwing out of people over these things, do we?
Sorry, say again?
We have constant levels of cronyism in every sector of the economy. It's just that it's only when it reaches a certain level of cronyism that people then say, okay, well, actually, maybe you shouldn't be doing that, right? And so do we have non-stop constant protests about every single thing that goes on in capitalism?
There's certainly something in every industry, probably. I mean, you've got the climate change people moaning at corporations for their emissions. You've got the animal activists moaning at the meat and dairy industries. You've got things like the in the media. You've got obviously the kind of anti-media, alternative media movement, which could be seen as both a protest and like a new formation of that. Then you've got things like name another industry, and I'll try and.
The banking industry, with people still complaining about the fact that the TARP bailouts happened in 2008.
Yeah, sure. There you go.
Even though those were absolutely vital for the functioning of the system.
I mean, that's a different conversation.
System, but yeah, obviously
that's a different conversation. But it's so like to say that there's not like a protest going on about like at least one thing in every industry is, I think, disingenuous.
I suppose, but I mean, this is one of those things where this interlocking of the protest first against Anita Sarkeesian, who was saying wrong things, basically, and then just being merging into this crusade for ethics in gaming journalism, which had never had the ethics they were trying to reimpose onto it, and probably still doesn't anyway.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, having that then transition from there to some kind of like broader criticism of like the entirety of Western feminism, which is what they went on to do, because that's how he ended up fighting against Lacey Green and having strange fights against MTV and stuff like this. Like, what did people expect was going to happen if they go from that to suddenly now running for political office? I mean, what did they actually think was going to happen?
Well, they didn't really know. No one had ever done it before. Like, sometimes they've got to take a leap of faith. They've got to take a risk. Like, Sargon may represent some tiny proportion of the actual general population. Let's say even represents less than 5%, right? And nothing that he says resonates with anyone else. Well, this has been a good test. The only person who gets destroyed over it is himself.
Well, I suppose it's an interesting test. On a separate note, because I figured I should actually mention this at some point during this interview as well. People were trying to draw an interesting parallel with me today, where basically I pointed out that Sargon, I should keep calling him Carl Benjamin. I pointed out that Carl Benjamin had actually said the things that he had said, and whether someone wants to take them as a joke or not a joke, the media was not lying when they directly quoted him on the things that he had said.
No.
Exactly. And so people then responded, people in your camp, such as Academic Agent, then responded by actually inventing 4 lies, putting them on Twitter, and then saying, see, this is the equivalent. Is it, though, in your view?
Inventing 4 lies? Sorry.
Yes, inventing 4 lies. I stood accused, randomly, by these people. I was accused of calling for mass genocide in Africa, to which no one ever showed me a quotation on this, given that I have never said that.
Oh, yes, I remember
Up until now, no one can tell me where this quotation is, and the reason why is because, of course, there isn't one. The second thing I was accused of doing was trying to remember them now.
I am scrolling through Twitter trying to see, because I was linked to it.
Yeah. Get to Academic Agent's Twitter on this, and you'll see the ones that they've come out with.
Let me see. Man, the man tweets a lot. Just bear with me 1 second. You have been dominating my notifications for today as well. It's a joy.
Yep, I'm being asked in the chat whether I'm a gamer. No, I'm not.
Nope. No one's asking you to be.
No, they're not asking me to be. They're just asking me whether I am. And I'm saying I am not. I would not class myself in that category at all. So there are some things I can't answer on that.
Let me see. Not color. About this. Yeah, how long ago it was? Like 2 or 3 hours ago, was it?
Yeah. No, more than that. Way more than that.
Okay. 9 hours. I swear to God if I miss this now. Here we go. Talk to known extremist far-right thought leaders.
Yeah, like, I don't know where that came from, because no one has actually named who the extremist far-right thought leader I supposedly talked to. So,
well, I presume he's talking of himself.
I mean, maybe he's talking of himself. I mean, this is ironic, right? So yeah, okay, next one.
Courted an alt-right audience, which would be his
yeah,
own.
that's bizarre as well, because I don't think I've courted an alt-right audience. If you actually look at the statistics since mid 2015, I did have a wave of alt-right people join to follow me for like no apparent reason, because they were joined to follow everyone during that time period. And then as soon as I began talking to them, they all unfollowed me. So that would seem to indicate that I'm not courting an alt-right audience, given that I spent a lot of time making fun of them, dunking on them more generally, and then being sort of, very loudly unfollowed by the lot of them. So to say that I'm curating an alt-right audience would be absurd.
I think it's just courted. Anyway, advocated for the reduction of the Black African population.
And this is not true either. And so what actually happened was, we once had a stream in which I pointed out that human beings, in fact, do I actually have the notes? I do have the notes in front of me. So I actually said this, and I'll give you the quote of what I actually said.
Mm-hmm.
I said, quote, and this is line 63 from my notes from that interview, which was on the 4th of April 2018, which is called, what was it called? It was called Reproductive Choice in the Third World, or something like that. And it was on Academic Agent's channel. And I said the following, quote, "Let us take the case of reproductive rights, one of the critical fights of our times, which is not directly a workplace struggle. Are reproductive rights simply about women's ability to have access to abortion and contraception? No, in reality, reproductive rights ought to be called reproductive justice. A woman's right to choose is not just about the right not to have babies, but also the right to have them at a time, spacing, and place of our own choosing.
Mm-hmm.
Reproductive choice cannot be just about control over our ovaries. It's about control over our lives, about whether and when to have children, how many children to have time to take care of them, to have public schools to send them to have them and their fathers not be behind bars, and most importantly, to have a decent wage to be able to make decisions about all of those things."
Mm-hmm.
End quote. So I think it would take a blatantly dishonest person to extrapolate genocide from that quotation. Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm. Shown herself to be a TERF who creates a hostile environment for trans women.
Okay, yeah, so I'm accused of discriminating against transgender people. Like, I mean, I can't think of a time at which I have ever done that. So I don't know where that's coming from either. But again, there's no quote for that either, which means, of course, they don't have any quotations. They've just literally made that up whole cloth, because I guess, I don't know, maybe they want trans people to attack me for some reason. I don't know.
Sure. So, I cannot speak to the last two statements, but when it comes to the first two, talk to known extremist far-right thought leaders. All right, I do believe he's talking about himself here. And when he says courted an alt-right audience, he's not talking about anyone who's followed you in the past. I think he's talking about your engagement with his own chat. I don't think he believes that they're actually alt-right, although I know there's some in there. I don't think that he believes himself to be an extremist far-right thought leader either. But what he's trying to put across to you is these are the headlines, or these are at least those first two are two headlines which the mainstream media would call you.
But they wouldn't, because they would have nothing to go on. So, like, why would they? Well,
they have evidence.
The academic agent himself would make up out of nothing.
They have evidence. Like, they would call the academic agent far right, and they would also say that you're being on his stream and talking to the chat, and even to attack them, etc.
I don't think they would say that, because otherwise they would have to actually dunk on many of the people that they celebrate throughout the media, though, wouldn't they?
Such as,
okay, like for example, Dr. Christy Winters actually taught the Sargon of Akkad.
Mm-hmm.
Same Carl Benjamin. So why is she not being dunked on for talking to the evil Sargon or whatever? That doesn't happen. That's not how it works.
No, you're right. There's a double standard.
It's not a double well, okay, let's put it this way. If you guys think it's a double standard, then why would I be a victim of that double standard as opposed to a beneficiary of it?
I mean, you are a beneficiary of it in terms of, like...
So then why would there be a headline saying that I am an evil person who has taught to far-right thought leaders? It would be the other way around. It would be that I went on and criticized a, quote, far-right thought leader, so then I would not be subject to that headline, would I?
Well, is that the sort of thing which has been happening to Carl Benjamin? Because he's gone on and he's debated the alt-right many times.
Yeah, but I don't think he's accused. I don't think he stands accused of being the alt-right.
Yes, he does. He gets called far-right all the time.
If someone did accuse him of doing that, that would also obviously be false, because Carl Benjamin is not part of the alt-right. He gets into too many fights with them to be part of them.
He gets called far-right all the time.
It's possible to call him far-right in a weird conception that you see people on the left in the UK have, where it's basically anything to the left of, anything to the right of, I don't know, anything to the right of, what's his name? Surname is Clark.
Not familiar.
He's a Tory politician. I was going to use him as the example of a centrist.
I don't know.
Surely you know this individual.
I
he's a very round-shaped individual. His surname is Clark.
I probably do, but it's midnight.
Unbelievable. Well, anyway. I guess none of us actually remember the name. Ken Clark. That's what I'm talking about. Clark. Yeah, yes. So basically, you could come from some sort of very strange perception of politics in which everything to the right of Kenneth Clark becomes the far right. But yeah, I mean, if people say that, then they're obviously incorrect.
Yeah, they are, but that's the mainstream media.
However, I don't think that the mainstream media would position me as being to the right of Kenneth Clark in the first place. So, I mean, I would never fall into that category. And so what was the second one? The one with me courting an alt-right audience? Like, they would obviously never say that either, because they'd obviously take one look at my Twitter account and come off with a completely different impression of what I'm doing.
Sure. So what AA is...
The third one they would not do, because that would be obviously ridiculous as well, given that I read out to you the quote in question.
Sure, they wouldn't. The point,
genocide from me supporting the right to choose.
The point is that they wouldn't do this to you, but that those kinds of smears, which you are actually categorically saying are incorrect, which is true. You haven't called for these things. You haven't done these things.
Comparable to what happened to Carl Benjamin, because Carl Benjamin actually said the things which are being quoted, whereas in the case of these four things which academic agent created about me today, for example, none of them have a single shred of a quote to back them up. They would have to be basically just a disgruntled person saying, well, I subjectively believe that Rei Murasame may be thinking these things. Okay, good for you. Have you got a quote? No. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where they are. I mean, especially the fourth one, the one where I'm accused of being a TERF. I mean, there's literally no quote for that.
The only one I can think of
the only thing on that is a feeling.
The only ones that I can think of which are quotable are 1 and 2, which they can easily pull any part of the transcript from any debate you've had with AA where you've addressed his audience. You can take any quote from any UO which you've been on where you literally have talked to him.
But I mean, they would have to engage in some serious wrangling.
And they do.
Make those quotes sound like anything bad. Considering
but they do.
What they're going to be quoting is me telling the right off. So what are they going to do? Say, oh, she's very bad, you see, because she keeps telling people to be good. Really?
Yeah, don't underestimate their ability.
No, I'm not getting a comparison because of the fact that these things don't line up. Like, there's on the one hand, there's directly quoting a person without altering the text of what they've said. And then on the other hand, there's people saying, well, the media could actually just make up lies whole cloth about you. And I'm like, well, yeah, but they're unlikely to do that.
Have you seen, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on this. But the idea is like, have you seen Carl Benjamin's interview with Sky, the unedited one? Yes, you have, haven't you? Because we talked about
Yes,
this
I watched.
before.
Yeah, I watched the unedited one.
Where you said that in your view it made him come off even worse.
Yeah,
Um,
because of the fact that the amount of time that he had now made it look as though that he wasn't even dancing on his feet. He had like loads and loads of time to come up with ideas to say about what he thinks an MEP should be doing.
and in your view,
And then what he did was he essentially took the cheap way out and threw his arms in the air and was kind of like, well, what does an MP do anyway? Which was the exact wrong thing to say, because when
yes,
someone says something like that, obviously the media is going to go and say, okay, let me just drag the slider here and say, okay, at the beginning of what does an MP even do anyway, and then at the end we'll say we'll just end the clip there. That's obviously what they were going to do.
yeah, obviously, like that particular statement, it's not the way I would have answered that question, because it was clear that it was too abusable. But that's also, that the statement given by itself, without context, does not make clear the idea that he is making a point about the fact that MEPs have very little power and actual democratic power. They can't propose, and they can't propose alterations to legislation.
Indeed. I mean, obviously, and he could have made that complaint. In fact, and people may laugh at me on this one, because this is something where occasionally I'll make a prediction, one that I haven't actually said aloud, and it'll be proven wrong, and I'll be surprised by it being proven wrong. And I actually thought that Carl Benjamin was going to be that kind of candidate, i.e., I thought what he was going to do was he was going to take the knowledge that everyone's already angry with him about things he said in the past, and that he would come on and be very, very clean and normal, and kind of be like, no, don't you see? I'm just a normal person, and I don't see why you guys are so mad. Right? I thought that's what he was going to do, and that he was going to have like a list of policies he was going to read off, and he was going to basically act like Nigel Farage, but with less bombast. Right? That's what I thought he was going to do, and that all the rest of us would be left to seethe in anger at the fact that he's pretending to be like, a very suave politician. You see what I mean? And so
I
imagine
can
our
hear.
shock when he came out and decided he was actually going to step into the weeds and have the fight with Jess Phillips all over again.
Yes.
Like imagine this, for example. Imagine if when he had come out and they'd put the Jess Phillips comment back in front of him again, the wouldn't even comment, and he said, I regret it, I deplore it, and I will never do that again. And it was, that was a time when I was a more immature individual, and I didn't realize what the wider impact of the of the normalization of these kind of comments would be. And I can understand there's a debate to be had, but it shouldn't be had in that particular way,
I
etc.
think I think
Right? What would people have done in that case? People would have just would have only have been able to look at him in complete shock.
I think the difficulty with that is that he feels that it doesn't do what you think it does in terms of the normalization. It was making a very specific point, and he was like, I've got enough content on my YouTube channel for people to get a good feel of me without what the mainstream media says. Like, regardless of whether or not that's a good tactic, that is his tactic. But there's also this idea that he doesn't want to. He's observed over many years, like in the cases that he's looked at, that apologies to no one in particular and to appease a group of people who are outraged on the behalf of Jess Phillips, who has herself said that she is not affected, she doesn't really care about it.
Well, that's how he could have got it. I mean, obviously, I'm just speaking completely cynically here. Obviously, this is a hypothetical, because obviously I am one of the people who obviously knows that I don't agree with what he said. But hypothetically, let's say that I were playing from his side. Then, given you understand Jess Phillips' personality and the fact that she's talked to Jacob Rees-Mogg, that she's willing to accept apologies from people and all kinds of things, where you think, why does Jess Phillips do that? He could have actually pivoted out of that and somehow ended up with Jess Phillips accepting his apology if he had played that card correctly. And he could have actually resisted the calls to resign by basically saying, well, the person that I was when I said those particular things is completely different from, I don't know, what we're doing right now, right? That's how he could have done it.
I
Now, obviously,
suppose
it's a very long shot. Like, you don't want to be in a position where you have to do that. But in the case of Carl Benjamin, I mean, that is the only other way he could have done it. That either he either had only two choices. He could either have doubled down on what he had done before, or he could have gone the path of basically attempting an apology, attempting to retract, and attempting to make amends with Jess Phillips, and then saying, let's have a formal debate in which everyone will behave like civilized human beings or something. Or maybe not, depending on how bad she feels about it. Right? I mean, he could have gone for that and then pivoted from there to say, now let's get down to real policies as well, because, we're here to be mature adults or whatever. He could have tried that. It probably would have gone a lot better than what actually happened, which was them losing 80% of their seats on the local level, despite the fact that the Brexit Party, Farage's Brexit Party, was not even on the ballot to compete against him in that ideological space. So effectively, they lost to no one.
But we'll have to see how it plays out in the long run, won't we? Like, regardless. I mean, do you want them to succeed?
Well, not particularly. I was only saying that I was being neutral in the sense that I was trying to put myself in their shoes and pretending like I wanted them to succeed. But obviously, if once I get back into my own shoes, and obviously I don't want to actually succeed, and it's all deeply funny that he's messed up so badly. But if I were playing as him, I would be upset about this point.
I mean, the thing he's upset about is the fact that the media won't let this go. You'll notice in every interview where he says, "I'd like to speak about policies now. Thank you very much." And I've already answered dozens of times as to this statement. You know what my answer will be, and so I'd like to get down to brass tacks on what I want to do in the European Union, etc., etc., and why I'm standing and what my core beliefs are. But they're not really interested in doing that because it's not sensational enough.
And also because now that his poll figures have dropped past that critical point, because this is something you notice that journalists do. Journalists will be very, very, very panicky about a candidate until the poll figures get to a point where they do not feel threatened by the candidate anymore. At that point, then it just becomes about beating the lol cow, right? And so what's happened now is, now that you've actually seen the case where UKIP is actually polling below other, they're going to keep hammering that one question. They don't care about the policy anymore because they don't think that he's ever going to be empowered to enact them.
Yeah, sure. That just proves my point that the media is
that if you're gonna behave badly, you should wait until you've actually captured the position. Then you can start behaving badly, because then they have to actually ask you about policy because you're doing things.
See, this is the disconnect that, or what you might see as the disconnect. So Sargon believes that whatever audience he could garner through the mainstream media means effectively nothing, because he has a large enough following already. He's already, in his mind, in that established position to be able to behave badly because he has nearly 1 million followers.
Well, do those followers translate into UK votes, though?
Because that's the big test, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it from their own statistics that they're saying that 80% of those people are not from the UK?
Well, I don't know. We shall see, won't we? Like, it's one of those things where, that's the tactic he's chosen. That's the belief that they've had. And what appears to have not paid off in the local elections, we shall see how it goes under proportional representation in the European elections.
Actually, yeah, I mean, you do have a good point on that, because obviously these electoral
you have to remember,
are completely different. Yes, it is quite different to be voting in the European context than it is in the
I mean, you have to take into account that UKIP in particular has been pushing national issues and European international issues much harder with this particular campaign. Now, I won't say it's anything to the success of it, and or to the success of the media in painting Carl in a particular light, but I will speak to the idea that they have not been doing anything which I could say has had a definitive focus on achieving local aims. They've been very pleased with some of the areas, because the areas which they have focused in on, the very specific areas, they've actually increased their the voting percentage there. Like, now, whether or not that's come at the cost of everything else is another matter entirely. But
one thing that he's done that you ordinarily should do that he hasn't done when he's relying on these YouTube stuff that he's been engaged in for years is he hasn't considered it from a district perspective. Like, even if we get down to like how many of those people live in the United Kingdom, then you still have to divide it down to, well, how many of the people live in the region under which becomes activated during the European elections.
Well, he wants, like, he's not just campaigning for the Southwest. Obviously, he's standing in the Southwest, but he's campaigning that nationally people should vote in the European elections. You have to remember it's a proportional representation vote. So, which is why the media today was getting mental, because it looks like where Tommy Robinson is standing. Like, I'm obviously not going to get too deep into the Tommy Robinson question, but but it looks like he only needs, I think, 7.6% of the vote in order to win a seat in his area, which has freaked the media out no end. So I've seen a couple of articles today going, we must challenge that.
No, I get what you're saying. So have they calculated how much Carl Benjamin needs in order to get?
Sure. So he's running second in the area. So the first candidate needs 11% in the Southwest, and he needs 33%, and they don't expect him to get in
Why didn't they put him in the first position then?
because it was a publicity stunt, as I understand it.
Isn't this just going to increase the opprobrium toward him when he loses because he can't get the 33%?
Sorry, say again?
Isn't this going to just increase the gloating that's directed toward him when he can't get the 33%?
Probably, but I don't. It's you
Lose
have,
then.
but it's not his. It's not his goal, as it were, to get elected because he doesn't particularly want to go to the European Parliament as much as it is to keep UKIP, the Brexit issue, and the hypocrisy in his mind of the media into the public space. He's about pushing the issues. It's not about getting elected to the European Parliament.
Well, I mean, if anything, his issue, the issues that he wanted to push are being clouded by the fact that he's constantly being dogged by this essentially this one set of questions.
That's the argument that could be made. He would see it as
digging further into.
He would see it as the fact that they keep going after these issues as opposed to the ones which actually, in his mind, matter. Because to him, a 3-year-old tweet and an off-color joke really means nothing in the long run, whereas the future of our country, in his mind, is at stake, and there are deep issues that need to be discussed. And exposing media hypocrisy and trying to, shall we say, like either improve the influence of the alternative media or at least encourage people to see to distrust the mainstream media even more than they already do, because he's obviously quoted things like the Trustpilot statistics for the mainstream media outlets, which are trending very low at the moment. That's what he sees his job as.
Okay. Well, I mean, this is going to be taken as a question that people will not see as a good question either. But I'm the queen of asking questions that people don't like. So here's one. Does he feel like at any point that the things he's saying are going to become redundant, given that the presently existing government is already committed, supposedly, to carrying out the Brexit process anyway? What is it that he thinks he's doing that the present government couldn't already have done without him?
I mean, he hopes that it becomes redundant because then there's no need for him to be standing on those issues. He's already said that all he really wants to do is go back to sort of a form of obscurity. Like he's very tired of the political mainstream. He wants to make. You remember? I mean, you probably haven't seen it, but he made a video earlier in the year about Starship Troopers. It was kind of his passion project. He did like an 1.5-hour video on that, I think it was, and he really enjoyed that stuff. He retired this week in Stupid. Like he doesn't want to be always chasing the news cycle, but he sees this kind of the media hypocrisy, the censorship from policy, and the European Union issue as being so potentially damaging that currently damaging that he cannot ignore it. Like he has his platform, which he considers to be of some influence, and arguably is, and he wants to be able to utilize it in a way to kind of fight his side of the culture war, because in his mind, if we lose, then we lose a lot of what it means to be British, a lot of freedoms for ordinary people, and we'll see a longer and more prolonged authoritarian streak over time. So to him, it's kind of like it doesn't matter. Like for him, it's kind of like an all or nothing fight in that regard.
Okay, all right, fair enough. But it's one of those things where
I mean, we're going to have to see how it plays out.
I mean, obviously, he believes this culture war that he's engaged in is something that's extremely vital to the country. It's just that it remains a mystery as to why he chose to do it in the specific way that he did it.
Sure. And I think we're going to have to see how it plays out over time. But I think I'm going to call the stream there. But it was great talking to you, Ray.
Well, there is one thing I want to say before we go as well, which is that people are questioning my phrasing when I said committed to the Brexit process. Now, obviously, people have disagreements as to what that Brexit process actually ought to be. So there is that. So I don't know. I'll give you some information which people may not have known, which I think is safe to actually say now.
Okay.
But at one point, there were actually 5 Brexit plans that existed, and so that got whittled down, didn't it? To the point where they had the deal as it existed, and people were just hoping to get the deal done. It's not really Theresa May's fault that certain members of her own party didn't like the contents of the deal. Not necessarily her fault that certain people in Northern Ireland didn't like the contents of the deal either, and that they actually held out to the point where they began to realize that they were strangling themselves, which is when certain politicians from Northern Ireland, who you may have heard talking about this recently, came out on Political Home and said, what was their quotation again? I'm trying to remember the exact phraseology. They said that they would rather have Remain than no deal.
The government said that.
No. That was some politicians in Northern Ireland who were regretting the fact that they had stonewalled Theresa May for so long on the issue of the backstop. And so when it came on to that, I mean, everyone's blaming Theresa May for this stuff, but is it really her fault if other people around her happen to behave in these irrational ways?
I mean, I think when it
Why
comes,
did people just have accepted the deal as it was? I think that was the best opportunity that they had to actually just get it done and get out. And then once they've gotten out, if they didn't like the way the European Union interacted with them as a result, then at least you're already out, and you can then essentially break off the rest of it under the idea. And this was an idea that was discussed by legal teams before, and many different legal analysts have looked at it in that way, saying that under Theresa May's deal, once you were already out and the European Union had agreed to deal with you fairly, if the United Kingdom had decided the European Union was not dealing fairly, they could have then broken off the rest of it but retained what had already been signed.
So the main thing with Theresa May...
Why didn't they just leave on that basis?
If I may. The main thing with Theresa May was she rejected having a council of advisors and decided that she was going to negotiate with the EU exclusively with the advice of only the Brexit secretary, who also got very frustrated. And as you know, we went through several of those. But she came back with a deal that was unilaterally rejected both by Remainers and by Leavers, because under her deal, we would have become a vassal state with an untenable position in that we would have had a what's the word I'm looking for? Like an indefinite holding period before we, quote, transitioned out. However, that period was completely at the behest of the European Union. We had absolutely no control over it.
That's not true, though. Didn't they say that the control lever that the United Kingdom had over that period was that if the United Kingdom determined that the European Union was not acting in good faith, then they can essentially just terminate that?
Not as far as I'm aware, but I'll concede
that's what they kept trying to say constantly.
Okay, well,
people should not get upset about the report saying that you can't get out of it, because actually there's a clause in there that literally says you can. And so they kept trying to emphasize that. No one was listening to them, because obviously whenever Theresa May opens her mouth, people start falling asleep because she does sound like a bit of a policy wonk, or she just sounds annoying, for example, or at least people perceive her to sound annoying. Like, she doesn't sound annoying to me, but I do get the impression that people find her voice to be annoying. So people don't listen to her when she actually says these things, and then that's how we ended up in this mess, really.
She's not annoying, she's infuriating. But the key issue for both Remainers, like we'd have lost our vote because we were obviously going out, but we would have still been beholden to all of the economic and cultural policy of the EU, including things like the oft-mentioned EU army stipulations would have come in that we would have been required to comply with and stuff like that. So it reduced a lot of freedoms, which the Remainers, many of whom were Remain and reformers, were not very, very happy with. The Leavers obviously were not going to be happy with that at all, because there was no question of us being in control of the majority of our economic policy. And so it was rejected by that. And then when it was put to the public to read, etc., it was also almost unanimously rejected by them, because to the Remainers it wasn't remaining, and to the Leavers it wasn't leaving. And so it tried to strike a happy balance and failed miserably.
But I mean, this is one of the endemic problems of the way this particular democratic system works as well. Because you think to yourself that on something as important as this, you figure that if everyone's not getting precisely what they want, you'd at least just want to get it done.
Well, there was
right? And then afterwards, you can essentially do the usual perfidious Albion thing at the end and fiddle about with it anyway. But once you've gotten out, then at least you're out.
Well, that's the question. It was like people saying, well, we wouldn't be out, right, because of the beholdenness to EU policy.
Yeah, but then you just violate it. This is one of those things. I mean, obviously, I just said that aloud, but yeah, you could just violate it if you actually get to the point where the court will not accept that the EU is acting in bad faith for some bizarre reason. Like, I can't imagine why that would happen. But if that did happen, then at least you're already out, and then you could actually blame everything on the European Union and cut off the rest of it. But as it stands, by actually staying in the way that we are right now and continuing to have these internal debates where everyone is tearing each other apart as the European Union stands and watches, it kind of makes the United Kingdom look bad, makes the United Kingdom look unstable, and so on. And
It
so I wouldn't
certainly
have
is, yeah.
anticipated that they would have done it that way around in the beginning.
I can definitely see that perspective. Like when it comes to like I've completely lost my train of thought. Forgive me, but the we were talking about we could have just violated it. Yeah, I think that was entirely possible. Yes, that was right. So the this was the difficulty with the referenda on such a controversial issue that they never expected to be quite so controversial.
Mm.
The idea that you had this split between this very Remain heavy parliament and a 50-50 split in the general population, and this idea that like you didn't have a united front to get the Leave side of things done, and so you then ended up with conflicts. And like I can see why Theresa May probably decided to go it alone, because like she was going to try and get the best deal that she could, and she didn't want to be influenced by a heavily Remain parliament, but failed to take into account the fact that she was heavily Remain herself. So it was quite tricky because she's like, it's like a conflict of interest. She's arguing in favor of a position she doesn't want nor believe in. And so I can see
Well,
how the
that's
situation.
not necessarily the case either, because it's possible for her to have been Remain, and then once it became a fact of Leave, then she could have decided that she just wanted to do what had been placed in front of her because
And I'm sure she did,
of
and
personality.
I'm sure she tried her very best, but it's just that her vision did not line up with what people believed the vision for Leave was, which was flatly on the piece of paper to leave the
That just
European
means that
Union.
I don't think they understood what Leave was supposed to mean then.
Well, that's kind of like the argument both ways, isn't it? It's like the government didn't understand what we meant by Leave, and they're like, well, you didn't understand what we were offering by Leave, and so on. So it kind of goes back. And so there was this very simple statement on a piece of paper with an infinite amount of depth to it, really, on this thing. But I don't think we'll get to the bottom of that tonight. And I do have to get up early in the morning, so I'm going to bring things to a close here. But thanks for talking to me, Ray. I think it's
No
been
problem. There is
respectful.
also one thing I'll remind the listeners of as well before we close off on this, which is that people seem to see this kind of like Remain versus Leave as kind of like a culture war thing of some sort. I actually have never believed that Remain versus Leave was a culture war. Remain versus Leave seemed to have been a strategic outlook difference between reasonable people who may all be supporting what they believe to be the United Kingdom's best interests.
I've seen it as a four specific camps. So you had the economic leavers, you had the economic remainers, and then you had the nationalist remainers, and you had the nationalist leavers. So you had the people who believed that the economic policy of the EU was degrading the economies of different member states, and that we'd be better off freer to trade with more partners. That was an economic argument for leavers. On the Remain side, they said, look, we've got this status quo. It seems to be working quite well for us. We're the fifth largest at the time economy in the world. We have good trade links with like loads of EU nations because of the single market. Why would we jeopardize that? Kind of be for stability.
Yeah.
Then you had the nationalist argument for leaving, which was, look, the EU controls so many of our policies, and we don't like that, and we want to be in control of ourselves. And even if we go down under our own steam and not at the behest of another nation, where we had no way out of it. And then there's the nationalist Remainers who are saying, look, the EU is either, like, again, that was split in two, wasn't it? It was like either we hate our current politicians, the Tories are evil, and they're destroying our country, and the EU is going to save us, and they're the ones who bring in like decent food standards, and they bring us closer together as a European community, and the Schengen zone, and being able to freely move around the place makes things easier to be more interconnected with different cultures. That was the nationalist argument. And then there was the other side, which was saying, despite the fact that there are issues within the EU democratically, like we're in favor of the EU as an idea, and we want to remain with voting power that we have to try and make a difference, to try and reform the EU into more democratic and a more kind of constitutional entity.
Yeah,
And
that was a position a lot of people used to hold.
So those are the arguments, and I say that as someone who, at the time, was a Remainer. So I ended up.
I mean, for the record, did you guys know that I voted Leave?
No, I didn't. It's fine.
Which is astonishing, given that I've probably said it about 100 times now. Yeah.
Oh, don't underestimate my ability to being totally deaf, Ray. So there's that.
But yeah, I actually did vote leave.
But I am gonna have
Of course, it was not for any nationalistic reasons. The reason I voted leave was purely for strategic reasons. But I think probably people need to ask me about that someday, and I'll explain the full reason as to why I did what I did there.
Sure. So no, but I'm going to bring us off. Thank you everyone for joining us. Looks like we peaked at around 200 people. It's been a pleasure. If you're new, like, comment, subscribe, etc. Let me know what you thought of this discussion. Until next time, I'll have a new video for you tomorrow. Take care.
All right, see you all later.